This podcast is brought to you by Osprey Approach. In conveyancing, fixed fees mean every minute counts. Too much admin eats into your profits, and inefficiencies slow transactions down. Osprey Approach is a legal software built for law firms, helping conveyancers stay in control by managing cases, accounts, documents, and compliance all in one place. From automated client updates to post-completion workflows, Osprey streamlines every step, cutting admin time and keeping transactions moving. Osprey Approach. We make running a law firm easier.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today I welcome Rob Gurney onto the podcast, a regular contributor. Rob is the Managing Director of Ochresoft, part of the Landmark Group. And the topic of conversation today is a question, actually, we're going to pose to you, Rob, off the back of a recent report that Landmark have published. Why don't lower volumes mean faster property transactions? And there's some data here. You've got some empirical data as well that says that in the last 10, 15 years, and certainly as far back as 2007, which is where the data goes back to, transaction times have effectively doubled during a period when we've got more technology. All right, we've probably got fewer staff, but certainly over the past 5 years, we've got much lower transaction volumes as well. So plenty to get our teeth into today. Thank you very much indeed for joining.
Yeah, always a pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.
For those of you who haven't heard Rob on the podcast before, Rob, perhaps you might give us a very quick, who are you, what do you do, please?
Sure. So as you said, Managing Director of Ochresoft, been in post for actually just coming up to 5 years. Ochresoft, obviously synonymous with conveyancing workflows and private client workflows as well. We have IntelliWorks as a case management system that's well established in the market. But my background is property lawyer for over 20 years, working in a whole range of law firm sizes, but feel like I know the market, the industry, and the problems that go with it.
So let's dive right into this question. Why don't lower volumes mean faster property transactions? Rob, that's a big question to answer. Why don't you take your first bite?
Sure. It's a brilliant question. And actually, it's a very reasonable one as well, isn't it? The expectation ought to be, if you've got less work to do, perhaps you might be more sort of efficient at doing it. As a starting point, it's a very reasonable expectation. We know, and the statistics prove that, as you say, the time scales for property transactions have just continued to increase and increase. Now, I will just caveat that because we've just released the 2024 statistics, which show a very small improvement in the number of days that it takes on average, for a property purchase transaction to take place. So we'll touch on that in a bit. But yeah, you're right, the trend is an upward one. And I suppose the first thing that I'm going to call out, and the timing of this is really good, because you yourself, David, published an article earlier this week in relation to the Law Society announcement that there's a 15% drop in the number of conveyancers post-COVID. So I think there's your first sort of culprit, if you like. There's less people doing the work than there used to be, and therefore that absolutely needs to be taken into account. But I think the second point, which perhaps is even more pertinent than the first, is let's not pretend that conveyancing is the same as what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. We talk about, the process hasn't changed, but actually we've continued to add to it all the time. We've talked before, haven't we, David, about scope creep and the number of additional responsibilities that have been added to the role, sometimes covertly, without anyone really noticing, and then other times with a big loud crash, like Building Safety Act is a perfect example of that. But I think this is an important statement to make, which is it simply is not fair to judge conveyancer performance based on how long it used to take. I think there was a survey carried out to suggest that the number of responsibilities in conveyancing these days is double what it was 15 to 20 years ago. So again, it's crazy to even have an expectation that that isn't going to have a profound impact on the time it takes to get through the process. That's a fairly decent sort of stab at answering that question, I think.
The phrase, how do you eat an elephant, comes to mind, one bite at a time. It's a huge question, isn't it? Let's look at some of the numbers just for reference. The data comes from this recently released landmark report. And if you look at sales data, the average time from instruction to completion in 2007, according to the report, was 85 days. Instruction to completion in 2024, 160 days. On purchases, 2007, 75 days. 2024, 120 days. As we say, pretty much double. The only metric, and the report looks at instruction to completion, exchange, mortgage offer received, inquiries, and we'll come on to inquiries shortly, no doubt. The only metric that's decreased is the time it takes for searches to be returned. And so we can take that out of the equation in terms of why transactions take so long, which was for a long time a stick that was used to beat conveyancers with, wasn't it?
I've spent quite a number of years trying to dispel that myth because, it isn't search turnaround times that delay conveyancing transactions. Of course, we're talking about averages here, and it's important to note that you're always going to get one or two local authorities that aren't quite as cooperative as others. But yeah, I think I'm going to sort of hang my hat on this. It's not search turnaround times that delay transactions. The only thing that we do need to be very mindful of is the timing of search ordering is going to be critical. So if, for example, you did delay ordering your search pack until very late in the transaction, of course it's going to have an impact. But you've said that the numbers 10 days on average to turn searches around in the grand scheme of things do not contribute to conveyancing delays.
Which kind of leads us into, well, what does? You've talked about staffing and you've talked about the scope of the role as well. There are other bottlenecks that conveyancers face that you've identified through the report as well. Talk us through your experience of some of those bottlenecks and how we can start to push through them. You've already alluded to the fact that the data, for example, although it's seen an upward trend up to the end of 2023, actually saw a slight downward trend last year.
Yeah, and that's positives, and we'll always take positives, won't we? So, for example, we saw on purchases, instruction to completion times has dropped 3 days, instruction to exchange times dropped 6 days, and most remarkably, the inquiries process, which is plotting from when the first inquiry is raised to the last inquiry resolved, reduced by 8 days between 23 and 24, which obviously is a good thing. What's really important to note is that despite those improvements, the 52 days, which is now what it took the inquiries process to be resolved on average on property purchase in 2024, is still double what the time it took in 2007. So yes, we are seeing these decreases, and that's really good. But it's still way beyond what the modern day consumer expects. Before we start talking about the bottlenecks, why do we think that the 23 to 24 data has shown those improvements? Well, there's a couple of theories. I think it's really pertinent to suggest that you've already talked about the numbers, so I won't repeat them, but we're seeing that sale transaction timescales are increasing still, whereas the purchase side has come down. Now, obviously, the purchase side is when a buyer is found and instructs a lawyer and the conveyancing starts. So the suggestion here is that if the sale time on average is continuing to rise, then the only sort of theory that could potentially cause that is if more lawyers are being instructed early on in the transaction on the sale side prior to a buyer being found. Obviously, we've talked about material information and the prospects that lawyers might benefit from being able to sort of get involved earlier on in the transaction and sort of root out some of this information that they know is going to be needed at an earlier point. And I think it's fair to say that the quicker a sale side lawyer is instructed, then of course the better the chances of the purchase being smoother, quicker, less inquiries to raise, for example, more documents provided up front, etc. So I do think that it's certainly not a trend. We can't say that a 1 year differential equals a trend, but that would be my sort of best guess as to why we've seen that departure between sales and purchase side both increasing. Long may that continue. In terms of the inquiries time scale reductions, I think it's fair to say that more emphasis has been put on the management of inquiries in 2024 than we've ever seen before. I think it's a much more talked about issue that perhaps wasn't pinpointed as a conveyancing delay. We're aware that there's some inquiry management tools on the market now, and I just think that actually there is more focus on that area than there ever has been, and that potentially has caused this decrease. Again, I will just restate, we're still seeing the timescale being double what it was less than 20 years ago, despite the 8-day improvement from 23 to 24.
There's an analogy in the report which I have to say I quite like, which is thinking of conveyancing almost like a bakery. And bear with us, listeners, because a bakery opens at 8 and the baker doesn't start baking until 7:30, they simply wouldn't be ready for the first influx of customers. Whereas in most cases, a bakery is going to be starting much earlier in order to be able to open ready for those first few customers. That's in essence what you're saying, isn't it? That by instructing earlier, by perhaps getting more information up front. There was a really interesting DPMSG podcast released in recent weeks in which even lenders are looking at that whole upfront information piece and saying, okay, well, how can we improve our decision making by utilizing that information? It's been a bit of a stick that the naysayers have used, but having more information can only be a good thing.
Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
I'm a massive believer in the fact that the seller's lawyer is best placed to know what the buyer's lawyer is going to need in order to progress with a conveyancing transaction. So if they get instructed earlier than the other side's lawyer does, then they should be spending that time preparing the documentation, the data, the pack in readiness so that there is no delays or unnecessary delays once the conveyancing takes place. You're absolutely right. There's no point opening at 9 o'clock if the bread's not ready. But that's what we're doing, right? The current conveyancing process, you open the doors at 9 o'clock and the bread's not ready until midday. So I like that analogy a lot, and I do think there's a lot to take from it.
So where do we go from here? We've got what might be best described as marginal gains that we can make, and as you say, we've seen that already within the inquiries process. We've seen that as part of the upfront information process. But as the report highlights, we're still working with a piece of legislation that was enacted 100 years ago this year. Is there still a fundamental change that needs to happen in that process to enable this to be properly streamlined?
I think very much so, David. Yeah, obviously the government have recently announced a proposal, haven't they, to digitise the home moving and selling process. And I suppose I would just echo the concerns that your readership have talked about in terms of their fears that just by digitising data that's currently held in other formats is not actually the answer, is it? It's not going to change the process. We need to streamline that process. Otherwise, you're just replacing one method of information gathering with another. But actually, if we still do the exact same job that we always used to do, then we're not actually going to experience the types of efficiency gains that we're hoping for and expecting. If you pardon the pun, it is very much, what you've got and what you do with it. We absolutely need to look at the process and see where we can get those efficiencies from, utilizing the methods that digitization is going to sort of be promote for us. And I predict a world where all unnecessary additional inquiries should be eradicated. I use those words carefully because, of course, the inquiry process is a fundamental part of conveyancing, and absolutely you would always expect lawyers to be able to raise pertinent legal issues on the process. But I go back to that point, if the seller's lawyer is aware of exactly what the buyer's lawyer is going to need for a seamless transaction, then I'm a big believer that all of these unnecessary queries that turn into time delays should be eradicated. And I think that we can utilize that by changing the process and adopting new technologies that's going to help where we need help.
I think there's a fairly universal acceptance that things can change, things could change, things potentially need to change. Where the ball is dropped, if you like, is what that change looks like. There doesn't seem to be any real consensus around that. Have you got a view of what those changes look like?
I recently spoke at the Conveyancing Association conference, and part of that presentation was based on some really rubbish slogans that I put together. But I'm a big believer that we do need to sort out the sale first, and that involves getting lawyers on board as early as we possibly can, at the point of listing rather than at the point of sale. I'm genuinely passionate that will, in and of itself, have a massive beneficial impact on the subsequent conveyancing transaction, as long as the lawyers obviously are paid for the work that they're doing up front and carry it out diligently. So yes, sort out the sale first. Once the sale is sorted out, then again, rubbish slogan time. I think I had a slide that suggested we should squish the purchase. And what I mean by that, of course, is let's not beat around the bush, David. Artificial intelligence, large language models, they are all on the horizon, and we do need to start taking notice of the efficiencies and accuracy benefits that we can glean from embracing modern technologies. I'm not for a second suggesting that systems will replace lawyers in the process, of course not. But there's huge efficiency gains ready and waiting for lawyers to embrace, and I do think that whether lawyers like it or not is happening. It's around the corner. The big bang is around the corner, and I do think that there's a lot of legal processes that can be enhanced by utilizing and adopting technology. So I know that's potentially a controversial thing to say. What I would say is, this expectation versus reality from a consumer perspective, the only way that we are going to be able to come anywhere close to meeting the modern customer requirements is by massively streamlining the process. We've talked about the fact that purchases on average are now taking 4 months, and that's simply not acceptable. The consumer isn't going to change their belief that it should be much, much quicker. With the number of responsibilities that we've already talked about in conveyancing, I'm not really sure how else you address that situation. Sure, we can, say more experienced conveyancers would chip away at that 4-month timescale, but it's not going to bring it down to 2, 3, 4 weeks, is it? Technology does have the answers, as long as we're open-minded enough to accept that that's the future of the profession.
It was put to me recently, and perhaps this is controversial as well, Rob, that one of the mental blockers to progress is caseload. Now, bear with me, because obviously a lot of sizable conveyancing firms will be running caseloads of 80 to 100 matters, and there's a lot of criticism of that. But the point that was being made to me was that technology potentially has the ability to enable a conveyancer and possibly a team to run closer to 150, 200 cases for the sake of argument, because it is doing that admin legwork. I mean, dare I ask, is that something that you ascribe to, or do you think that that's not the right direction of travel?
I think
or do you think that we do have this mental block around case volumes?
Yeah. The great thing about some of the technologies, like I say, that will be becoming available onto the market for the conveyancing industry is that I think it's going to be the great leveler. I do think that these efficiency gains can be harnessed not just from the big law firms that you refer to, but for all types of law firms carrying out this legal service. And I suppose the biggest game changer for me will be, and the reason why I do subscribe to your point of view to a certain extent, is the reason that conveyancing cases are so labour intensive isn't just because of the legal work that the lawyer has to get through, but there's so much communication that's needed, every day, updates to the estate agent, to the mortgage broker, to the client themselves, chasing the other side's lawyer for missing documentation and data, etc., etc. We all know the problems of the day-to-day. If you can substantially reduce the time it takes to do conveyancing, by definition, you're also massively reducing the amount of updating, the amount of communication that you need on each transaction. I would suggest that, it's not necessarily hugely controversial to say, well, if you can half the time it takes to do conveyancing, then potentially you could increase your workloads, your caseloads by the same degree, if that makes sense. It's a matter of maths more than anything else, isn't it?
And of course, there's a potentially positive knock-on effect on fees, which you would hope would not be driven down by efficiency, but would actually enable firms to be making more money per matter.
Absolutely. I would imagine that the average consumer would be much more willing to pay a greater fee for a quicker service. And also from a customer service perspective, what's the main reason for complaints? It's time delays, isn't it? So it's a win-win situation.
We've outlined a pretty utopian view of what could happen in conveyancing, I suppose, Rob. And what's important to remember here is that conveyancing is one part of the process. The report, interestingly, goes into Landmark's expertise in the lending community and in the estate agency community, and there's some commentary in and around both of them that's well worth a read. And there's two takeaways for me there. The first is that for estate agents, and I know we don't have a lot of empathy for them, but for estate agents, shortening the transaction time means that they churn their pipelines more regularly. They're able to make more money, which by extension means that conveyancers can make more money. And for the lending community, and by extension consumers, there is a hidden cost to time delays to consumers, because lenders have to price into their thinking that this is going to take time, and therefore consumers potentially lose out. And we've seen that time and time again in terms of the length of time it was taking for a transaction to go through and the mortgage offer expiring, and Bank of England base rates changing. And that was a massive issue, particularly over the last sort of 12, 18 months. So there are lots of fringe issues that can be resolved by speed and certainty as well.
Yeah, I think, you've hit the nail on the head there, haven't you? We talk about conveyancing transactions purchase, we've said takes 60% longer than it did in 2007 on average. And of course, there's a massive financial impact on the conveyancing community of that sort of happening, as well as the stuff like scope creep and the additional responsibilities they've inherited. But yeah, you're absolutely right to flag this is not a conveyancer only issue. This is a whole of industry issue. The benefits, the financial and otherwise, of sort of shortening the time period is going to be felt by all.
That's as much as we've got time for today, Rob. Thank you so much for joining.
That's always a pleasure. Thank you, David.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Rob. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.